It is March 10, 1997. The air is still, cold enough that your breath lingers in front of you, but not the kind of cold that keeps small towns indoors. Cozad, Nebraska, population just under 4,000, looks exactly as it should on a quiet Monday evening. Pickup trucks roll past brick storefronts. Families prepare for bed. And at the Amaco station off Interstate 80, the fluorescent lights buzz above rows of fuel pumps. A car pulls in. Not just any car. A red Pontiac Grand Am, the kind of vehicle that once turned heads in the mid-90s, now simply blending into the background. The model is somewhere between 1993 and 1995. It slows to a stop. The driver steps out, a white male, mid-20s. He isn't remarkable at first glance, medium build, average height, the kind of face you might not remember after passing in a grocery aisle. But there is something about him that would lodge in memory later. A stiffness. A caution. He does not move like someone stopping for fuel. He moves like someone rehearsing each step. He places the nozzle into the tank, begins pumping gasoline. He glances once toward the glass windows of the convenience store. A clerk is inside. Cameras are watching. Or at least, they should have been. After filling the tank, he walks inside, purchases a soda. Just a soda. And then, he disappears. At least, that is what the official narrative suggests. Because within hours of that mundane encounter, the quiet of Cozad would be ripped open. A homicide. A victim whose name remains tangled in whispers and case files. And a mystery that, decades later, has refused to let go of this town. The cold open. If you had been at the Amaco that night, you might not have noticed anything odd. A young man buying gas and a drink was as unremarkable as it gets. But for investigators, that fleeting image, the red Pontiac, the soda, the man in his mid-20s, would become a ghostly thread in a much larger, darker story. Because shortly after, somewhere between the hum of the interstate and the shadows of this small Nebraska town, blood was spilled. Someone lost their life. And for reasons never fully explained, this case was pushed into the cold margins of the VICAP system, the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. When cases make it to VICAP, it usually means they're unusual. Unsolved. Connected to patterns of violence. Cases that don't sit neatly on a local detective's desk but instead feel like part of something bigger. So why was this case, this ordinary-seeming man at the gas pump, elevated to that level? A town not ready for questions. Cozad in the late 90s was the definition of small-town America. Known for farming, for its proximity to the Platte River, and for its peaceful way of life. It wasn't a place where people locked their doors religiously. It wasn't a place where murder was supposed to happen. Which made what came next feel like an earthquake. Reports would later describe the homicide as brutal, but the details remain frustratingly scarce. Law enforcement has released so little, the story feels like fragments of a broken mirror. Locals whisper, but few are willing to speak on record. The official line is almost silence. What we are left with is an image, a man, a car, and a soda. The banality of it all is chilling. Because if that ordinary moment was the last time anyone saw the suspect alive, or if it was the last time the victim unknowingly crossed paths with their killer, it means the line between life and death was drawn in the fluorescent hum of a convenience store. Seeds of suspicion. When word of the homicide spread, questions erupted immediately. Who was the man? Was he simply a passerby, fueling up on his way west? Or was he tied directly to the killing? Some believe he was the killer himself. That the soda was nothing more than a prop, an attempt to appear normal on security footage. That he stood in line, can in hand, while quietly calculating his next move. Others suggest something stranger, that he was a witness. That he saw something he wasn't supposed to see, and his brief stop at the Amaco became the only surviving record of his existence before he vanished into the night. And then there is the most controversial theory of all, that the man wasn't a stranger at all. That he was known to someone in Cozad. Perhaps even protected by them. Into the VICAP shadows. The Nebraska homicide is now cataloged in the National Database of Unsolved Cases. But if you dig into public records, you'll find a frustrating lack of detail. No official suspect. No clear motive. Barely even a victim's story shared with the public. That silence has bred suspicion. In towns like Cozad, gossip fills the gaps where facts are absent. And what people whisper is often more dangerous than what they know. Why would investigators withhold so much? Was it incompetence? Negligence? Or something far darker? Because here's the thing, homicides don't just vanish. Evidence exists. Witnesses exist. And yet, for nearly 3 decades, this case has lived in a strange twilight, half acknowledged, half erased. The opening hook. Imagine yourself there, watching the man at the pump. You don't know yet that a life is about to be taken. You don't know that Cozad will be whispered about in hushed tones for years. All you see is a stranger filling his tank, buying a soda, leaving. And then everything changes. Some cases leave trails of evidence. This one leaves shadows. Shadows that stretch from a small Nebraska town all the way into the FBI's cold case archives. And tonight, we're going to follow them. Because sometimes the scariest stories are not the ones we invent. They're the ones that vanish into silence. When you drive into Cozad, Nebraska, the sign doesn't announce anything extraordinary. Just a population count, a nod to the Union Pacific Railroad that carved its way across the plains, and an unspoken promise of safety. Cozad was, and still is, one of those places where the greatest disruptions to life are school football games, harvest season, or the occasional snowstorm. But in 1997, under that quiet surface, the town held the same fragile vulnerability that all small places do. Places like Cozad survive on routine, on the idea that everyone knows everyone, and that no one is capable of anything truly terrible. That illusion shattered in March. Life before the shadow. The 1990s were kind to Cozad in many ways. Farmers saw steady yields, the town's modest downtown still pulsed with life, and kids pedaled bikes until dusk without parents worrying. The Amaco station, sitting conveniently near Interstate 80, was a hub of sorts. Truckers stopped for fuel, locals for coffee or cigarettes. At night, its bright canopy of lights was one of the few beacons on the otherwise darkened horizon. For outsiders, Cozad was a blip on the map. A bathroom stop, a tank of gas, maybe a snack before driving on toward Kearney or North Platte. For locals, it was a tight-knit web of familiarity. Everyone waved. Everyone knew which truck belonged to which family. Strangers stood out. That's what makes the image of the red Pontiac Grand Am so haunting. It didn't belong. Not in the way a familiar Ford or Chevy pickup did. And in a town where outsiders were noticed, this car, and its driver, would become unforgettable. The illusion of safety. In many small towns, crime is measured in stolen bikes or broken windows, not homicides. Cozad's police blotter rarely contained anything more serious than a bar fight or the occasional DUI. And while major crimes sometimes touched nearby larger towns, Cozad was largely untouched by that darker side of life. That illusion, of safety, of predictability, was part of what made the homicide so devastating. It wasn't just the loss of life. It was the crack in the narrative. If murder could happen here, in a town so small, then it could happen anywhere. People stopped leaving doors unlocked. Kids were called home earlier. Farmers looked twice at strangers idling on country roads. Fear spread not because people knew the details, but because they didn't. Silence in the records. The strange thing about the Cozad case is not just what happened, it's what wasn't said. The public narrative is a skeleton with no flesh. We know a man was seen at the Amaco. We know a homicide occurred. We know the FBI's VICAP cataloged it as unsolved. And then, nothing. No victim's name repeated in the local press. No suspect sketches circulated. No press conferences with sheriffs reassuring the town. Just silence. It is rare, almost suspiciously rare, for so little information to reach the public. Normally, law enforcement leans on communities to help solve cases. Eyewitnesses, tips, even the smallest fragments can matter. But in Cozad, the case seems to have been swallowed whole by secrecy. That vacuum has given rise to theories darker than the truth may be. Did investigators know more than they admitted? Was the victim someone connected to a powerful family? Or did the suspect have ties that made the case untouchable? The man who wasn't there. Imagine, for a moment, the Amaco clerk on duty that night. Did they notice the man's cautious movements? Did they remember his voice, his hands, the way he paid for the soda? If they did, those details never made it into any official report available to the public. And so the man becomes a phantom. Real enough to be captured in memory, maybe on tape, but abstract enough that he could be anyone. He could be the stranger you passed on a highway. He could be the man standing behind you at a grocery checkout. That is the first great horror of the Cozad case, the ordinariness of evil. Evil doesn't always arrive in a mask. Sometimes it buys a soda, nods politely, and walks back into the night. Community in shock. The whispers started almost immediately. A homicide in Cozad wasn't just rare, it was unthinkable. Coffee shop counters filled with speculation. Who was dead? Who had done it? Why was the sheriff's department so quiet? The lack of information only fueled paranoia. Some said it was drug-related, that Interstate 80 had become a corridor for crime bleeding into small towns. Others claimed it was personal, a crime of passion hushed up to avoid scandal. A few whispered about police involvement, corruption, cover-ups, protection of someone who should have faced justice. The truth? Still locked behind sealed files. The stranger and the soda. It is almost absurd, the way the case reduces itself to an image, a man buying a soda. But that is the cruel poetry of unsolved crimes. Sometimes the last known detail is banal, painfully ordinary. And yet, in that ordinariness lies horror. Because if that man was indeed the killer, then the only surviving evidence of his existence was a carbonated drink, an exchange of change, a receipt. A casual act that cloaked a lethal one. The soda becomes symbolic, a reminder of how killers sometimes hide in plain sight, cloaked in routine. A small town, a national mystery. By the end of March 1997, Cozad had changed. Life went on, as it always does, but with a faint undercurrent of unease. A murder unsolved is not just a hole in the justice system, it is a splinter in the soul of a community. And as the years passed, the case slipped further from public conversation. But somewhere in the Nebraska archives, it remained alive, tethered to the VICAP system, marked as cold but never closed. Which leads us to the uncomfortable question, what is more frightening? That a killer walked free into the night, never to be caught? Or that the truth was buried intentionally, sealed behind walls of silence, so that justice could never come knocking? The Cozad case forces us to confront both possibilities. And neither sits comfortably. The records are thin. The details, almost deliberately starved. Yet one thing is certain, sometime after that March evening in 1997, after the red Pontiac Grand Am rolled into Cozad's Amaco station, someone was murdered. A homicide. The kind that does not belong in a small Nebraska town. The crime was brutal enough, shocking enough, that law enforcement flagged it for VICAP, the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. But if you search the archives, you will not find the kind of detail one might expect. No timelines. No full victim profile. No news stories carefully tracing the final moments of the deceased. Instead, you find a vacuum, a crime spoken of in whispers but rarely in headlines. And yet, for those who lived in Cozad at the time, the murder was real. The silence surrounding it made it no less terrifying. The night of blood. Local lore remembers the night as unseasonably still. Some accounts place the crime in the outskirts of town, others closer to the main road. A body discovered, though the precise circumstances remain shielded. What is whispered consistently, however, is the violence of it. This was not a clean killing. It was not sterile. Some say it was rage. Others say it was panic. Whatever the truth, it left an indelible mark, a life ended, and a town scarred. The link between the man at the Amaco and the crime has never been fully spelled out. Was he the killer, moments away from committing violence? Or was he simply a shadow, an ordinary man whose path intersected with the case, captured in rumor because he vanished too quickly afterward? That uncertainty haunts the story to this day. The vanishing victim. In most homicides, the victim becomes the anchor. Their life is laid bare, who they were, what they loved, what was stolen from them. But in Cozad, the victim has been reduced to anonymity. A phantom presence, known only in whispers. Why? Why would a community not speak the victim's name? Why would law enforcement not clarify, not honor, not push for public vigilance? Some locals suggest the victim was connected to someone powerful. Others believe the family begged for silence, desperate to avoid the glare of public scandal. A darker theory persists still, that the victim's story was suppressed because it would raise questions authorities did not want to answer. Without a name, the victim becomes something else, a symbol. A symbol of how easily justice can be muffled. Whispers in the dark. What happens when you tell a small town that someone has been killed, but you don't tell them who, or why, or how. The answer is chaos. In diners, rumors grew like weeds. Some swore it was a drug deal gone bad, a cartel hand reaching into quiet Nebraska through Interstate 80. Others claimed it was jealousy, an affair, an intimate betrayal. One particularly scandalous whisper suggested that the victim was romantically involved with someone tied to local law enforcement. That theory painted the homicide as not just an act of violence, but an act of silence, a cover-up hidden under layers of secrecy. True or not, the rumor spread because the vacuum of truth demanded to be filled. In a small town, the less you say, the more people imagine. And in Cozad, the imagination went to dark, controversial places. The Pontiac in the spotlight. The red Pontiac Grand Am became the centerpiece of suspicion. Residents remember it not because Pontiacs were rare, but because it lingered in memory. Young man, mid-20s, stopping for gas and soda, then gone. It is almost cinematic, how one small, ordinary detail can become myth. But the car's presence that night became an obsession. Some say it was spotted again, just hours later, near where the body was found. Others claim it belonged to someone connected to the victim. Theories grew. Was the man at the pump a drifter? A stranger passing through? Or was he something more insidious, someone tied to Cozad's own inner circle, whose identity was never revealed because too many people wanted it hidden? The sheriff's silence. For the community, the silence from law enforcement was the loudest sound. There were no daily press conferences, no appeals to the public. There was, instead, a quiet insistence that the case was under investigation. Weeks turned to months, months to years. The homicide remained unsolved. The lack of transparency ignited a dangerous suspicion. Were the authorities protecting someone? When crime touches a small town, it doesn't just test the limits of justice, it tests the limits of trust. And in Cozad, that trust began to crack. A crime without closure. By the end of 1997, the homicide had become something of a ghost story. The shock had worn off, replaced by unease. Without details, without resolution, the crime became an open wound. Parents warned their children about strangers. People double-checked their locks. But beneath it all was the sense that the real danger wasn't some outsider, it was the possibility that the killer walked among them, protected by silence. And as the years turned into decades, the crime slipped deeper into the shadows. Only the VICAP record remains, a stark reminder that this was real, that someone died, and that someone else walked away. The questions left behind. What does it mean when a homicide has no public narrative? When the victim is unnamed, the killer unpursued, the evidence unreleased? It means one of two things: either the case was so mishandled it evaporated into failure, or it was buried, deliberately, to protect those who stood to lose the most from the truth. Both possibilities are equally chilling. And so the crime that shook Cozad is not remembered for what was revealed, but for what was concealed. A death that should have united a town in grief instead divided it with suspicion. A case that should have been solved became a riddle. And at the center of it all, the man at the pump, the red Pontiac, and the silence that followed. Law enforcement thrives on two things: evidence and trust. When a crime occurs, communities expect their sheriffs, deputies, and investigators to seek justice with transparency. But in Cozad, Nebraska, in 1997, the homicide that followed the sighting of the young man in the red Pontiac Grand Am seemed to slip instantly into a fog. The murder was real, filed, investigated, and eventually passed into the Federal Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VICAP. But what happened between those steps? That is where the mystery sharpens, and the silence grows deafening. What is VICAP? The FBI's VICAP is not where ordinary crimes go. It is not a routine filing cabinet for forgotten cases. Instead, it is a national database designed to track and compare the most violent, unusual, and unsolved crimes in America. Homicides with unknown offenders. Sexual assaults with disturbing patterns. Missing persons believed to be dead. For a case to end up in VICAP, local authorities must either request federal assistance or recognize that what they're dealing with doesn't fit within the neat boundaries of a single investigation. VICAP is, in short, for cases that resist resolution. So why did Cozad's homicide end up there? Was it because the killer disappeared without a trace? Or because what investigators found raised red flags too uncomfortable to speak of openly? A paper trail of shadows. What makes the Cozad case so unsettling is the lack of a clear public trail. When most small-town murders occur, there is at least a skeleton timeline in newspapers. Names, dates, coroner's reports, appeals for witnesses. Here, almost nothing. The file exists, yes, but the narrative around it is skeletal. The fragments that survive, the red Pontiac, the man in his 20s, the gas station soda, feel less like a case file and more like the opening shots of a thriller movie. And perhaps that is what makes it so disturbing. Because when authorities give you so little, the silence itself becomes the evidence. The question of secrecy. In small towns, secrecy spreads faster than truth. When residents realized the sheriff's office wasn't releasing details, speculation flared. Why the silence? Was the case too complex for locals to handle? Did the FBI step in because they saw something bigger? Or was it the opposite, that locals wanted to bury the truth, and handing it to VICAP was a way of shoving the crime into the background? Theories multiplied. Some whispered of law enforcement misconduct, others of political entanglements. A particularly scandalous rumor suggested that someone tied to the sheriff's office had a personal connection to either the victim or the suspect, creating a conflict of interest so glaring it could never be admitted. What is certain is this: law enforcement chose not to make this a public crusade. And in doing so, they fractured the trust of a community. Patterns of neglect or protection. One of the strangest aspects of this case is how it lines up with other cold cases of the 1990s in rural America. Across the Midwest, homicides tied to small towns and interstate corridors often went unsolved. But was this neglect? Or something more? Consider this: in cases where victims were marginalized, transients, hitchhikers, those living outside the center of community respectability, investigations often slowed to a crawl. Victims without powerful families had fewer advocates. But Cozad whispers tell a different story. The suggestion isn't neglect. It's protection. That whoever was tied to this case was too close, too dangerous, or too embarrassing to expose. And so the file went federal, swallowed into the VICAP system, where cases often linger for decades without resolution. The problem with small-town policing. To understand how such silence could take root, one must understand small-town policing. In a place like Cozad, law enforcement officers are not strangers. They are neighbors. They are classmates. They are family. When justice depends on investigating people you attend church with, or sit beside at football games, the line between objectivity and loyalty blurs. Sometimes, it bends. Sometimes, it breaks. The Cozad homicide tested that boundary. And for many, the sheriff's refusal to speak publicly about details was not a sign of professionalism, it was a sign of complicity. The FBI's quiet hand. It is telling that VICAP received this case. Normally, when the FBI becomes involved, there is at least a token acknowledgement, a statement about cooperation, about resources, about justice. Here, almost nothing. The handoff into VICAP feels less like a call for help and more like a burial. Place the file into a national system. Mark it cold. Let the years take care of the rest. And yet, the very act of filing it with VICAP ensures the opposite, that the crime remains, somewhere in the machinery of federal records, unforgotten. A paradox of memory and silence. A town divided. As weeks turned into months, Cozad itself grew divided. Some believed law enforcement was doing all it could, quietly, diligently, behind closed doors. Others believed the opposite, that law enforcement was not merely failing but actively suppressing the truth. The silence became its own kind of scandal. In the absence of facts, people made their own. Suspects were named in whispers, reputations destroyed over cups of coffee. Fear festered. And yet, no resolution ever came. It was not just a homicide anymore. It was a test of faith. Faith in institutions. Faith in the idea that even in the smallest of towns, justice still mattered. The VICAP silence. By the late 1990s, the homicide had officially become what no town ever wants, a cold case. The file went federal, sealed in the VICAP archives. The red Pontiac Grand Am became a myth. The man with the soda, a ghost. And the victim, unnamed, became a question mark carved into Cozad's memory. The silence was the story. And that silence would haunt not only the town but also every person who dared to ask, why? Why did this case vanish? Who decided the community didn't deserve answers? And perhaps most frightening of all, how many other cases like this are scattered across the Midwest, hidden in plain sight? The red Pontiac Grand Am is more than a car in this story. It has become the symbol, the beating heart of Cozad's unsolved homicide. The man behind the wheel, the white male in his mid-20s who filled his tank and bought a soda, remains the most enduring image tied to the crime. But who was he? In a case with so few facts, suspects are less identified than imagined. They exist in rumor, in theory, in whispers traded in hushed tones at kitchen tables. And yet, each whisper adds to the suspicion that the truth is buried not in evidence, but in silence. The stranger. The most straightforward theory is the one law enforcement seemed to lean on first. The man in the Pontiac was a stranger. Passing through on Interstate 80, on his way to somewhere bigger, somewhere else. If this theory is true, it paints the homicide as a random act of violence. A drifter who struck and disappeared. It is a comforting theory in one sense, it implies the danger left with him. But it is also deeply unsettling, because it means justice will never come. The stranger theory is simple. Too simple, some would say. The insider. Then comes the more controversial possibility. What if the man in the Pontiac wasn't a stranger at all? Cozad was small enough that outsiders stood out. For someone to slip in and commit murder without notice seemed unlikely. Many residents believe the killer was not a transient but an insider, someone known, someone trusted. If true, then the red Pontiac was not foreign at all. It belonged to someone tied to the community. Which raises the chilling question, did law enforcement know who it was all along? The victim's shadow. Another theory, whispered in scandal, is that the victim and the man in the Pontiac were not strangers to one another. Perhaps the victim climbed into that car willingly. Perhaps the soda and the gas were a pause before something darker, a confrontation, a betrayal, a final conversation that ended in blood. If this theory is true, then the Pontiac wasn't just transportation. It was the crime scene itself. A mobile coffin rolling out of Cozad and into memory. The corruption theory. This is the theory that keeps locals up at night, the idea that the man in the Pontiac was protected. Some believe he had connections to law enforcement or local officials. A son, a cousin, a brother of someone with influence. The kind of influence that can suppress details, silence records, and ensure the story never makes it into public view. This theory is fueled by the vacuum of information. In most cases, police beg for leads, releasing sketches, descriptions, timelines. But in Cozad, that never happened. Why? Perhaps because naming the suspect would have meant pulling down a house of cards too many people had built their lives upon. The uncomfortable rumors. Cozad is not immune to rumor. Some residents insisted the homicide was tied to drugs, a cartel hand reaching into Nebraska along the interstate. Others believed it was a crime of passion, an affair gone wrong, a lover's rage. But the most uncomfortable rumor was this, that the Pontiac's driver wasn't the killer at all, but someone who saw too much. That he witnessed the murder, maybe even knew the killer, and vanished not because he was guilty, but because he was afraid. That possibility reframes the entire case. Was the red Pontiac a suspect's getaway car, or the silent flight of a terrified witness? The car that wouldn't leave memory. Years later, locals still recall the red Pontiac with a kind of obsessive clarity. It wasn't just the make and model. It was the way it didn't belong. The way it stood out under the harsh Amaco lights. The Pontiac became a ghost story in itself. Parents told children not to linger at the gas station late at night. Drivers who owned similar cars found themselves under suspicious eyes. The vehicle became cursed, an ordinary machine turned into a symbol of evil. The absence of evidence. What haunts this chapter of the story is what is missing. No license plate recorded publicly. No sketch of the man released. No timeline connecting him directly to the crime. It is as though the Pontiac itself was deliberately blurred, the details withheld to keep the case unsolvable. That absence has fueled accusations of a cover-up. If law enforcement had nothing to hide, why not release every detail? Why not beg the public for help? Why not expose the Pontiac for what it was? The silence was louder than any press conference could have been. The chilling possibility. What if the Pontiac wasn't an outsider's car? What if it was parked in Cozad the next morning, cleaned and polished, sitting in plain sight? The thought chills because it suggests proximity. That the killer wasn't gone. He was there all along. And if that was the case, then everyone who passed by that car, everyone who nodded politely to its driver in the grocery store, was unknowingly brushing shoulders with a murderer. Shadows in the rear view. As the years passed, the red Pontiac faded from sight but not from memory. It remains the centerpiece of the crime, the symbol of everything unanswered. Was it driven by a drifter? A local? A killer? A witness? Or was it merely a distraction, something investigators allowed to stand in for the truth, while the real suspect went unnamed? The shadows around the Pontiac remain thick. And as with all good mysteries, the car itself becomes more than metal and wheels. It becomes a metaphor for the case itself, familiar, ordinary, yet forever out of reach. Every murder leaves two kinds of trails, the one in evidence and the one in whispers. In Cozad, Nebraska, the evidence was sparse, almost invisible. But the whispers? They never stopped. And as time passed, they grew darker, more scandalous, and more damning. Because behind closed doors, many locals didn't believe this case went cold because it was unsolvable. They believed it went cold because it was untouchable. The rumor of a forbidden affair. One of the most persistent rumors, spoken rarely in public, but kept alive in kitchens and backyards, was that the victim had been romantically involved with someone powerful. Not just a local official, but someone tied directly to law enforcement. The theory suggests that the murder wasn't random, wasn't a robbery, wasn't the work of a drifter. It was personal. Passionate. Dangerous. Imagine the scandal if it were true. A victim entangled in an affair with someone married, someone respected, someone wearing a badge. A confrontation turns violent. A death follows. And suddenly, the investigation is not just about solving a murder, it's about protecting reputations. The red Pontiac connection. Where does the Pontiac fit into this? Some locals believe the man in the Pontiac wasn't the killer, but the fixer. A trusted friend or relative brought in to clean up a mess. His presence at the Amaco that night wasn't coincidence, it was cover. The gas. The soda. The attempt to look ordinary. A brief moment of normalcy before disappearing into the dark with blood on his hands, or someone else's secrets in his trunk. If that theory holds water, it reframes the entire narrative. The Pontiac wasn't a stranger's car, it was a shield, driven by someone loyal to the wrong people. The missing name. The victim's name, conspicuously absent from public record, becomes even more suspicious in this light. Why hide a name unless that name threatens to unravel something bigger? Some say the family begged for privacy. Others claim the silence was imposed from above, a wall of secrecy erected not for grief, but for power. If the victim's identity revealed a relationship to law enforcement, to politics, or to someone in authority, the entire town would have demanded answers. By keeping the name hidden, the scandal was smothered before it could ignite. But whispers are like smoke, they slip through cracks. And in Cozad, smoke still lingers. Law enforcement under the microscope. This theory is dangerous because it asks a question few small communities want to face. What happens when the people sworn to protect you are the ones you fear? If the homicide was tied to law enforcement, through an affair, through protection of the killer, or through deliberate obstruction, then the silence of the sheriff's office is no longer puzzling. It is incriminating. The lack of press releases, the refusal to release descriptions, the absence of appeals for public help, all of it takes on a different light. Not negligence. Not incompetence. But strategy. A cover-up. The federal handoff. And this is where VICAP enters the scandal. Some locals believe the case was handed into the FBI database not to solve it, but to bury it. Once in VICAP, the file was no longer a local responsibility. It became federal, inaccessible, far from the town's hungry questions. It is a convenient way to kill two birds with one stone, claim the case is being handled, while ensuring no one local can dig too deep. The move looks professional on paper. But to those who suspect scandal, it looks like the perfect cover. The plot twist nobody saw coming. Here is the most controversial twist of all, whispered rarely, but enough to sting. What if the man in the Pontiac wasn't just covering for the killer? What if he was law enforcement? A young officer, a deputy, someone just starting out. Not in uniform that night, not on duty, but tied to the town in ways that made prosecution impossible. This theory reframes everything: the soda purchase, the deliberate calm, the silence afterward. It wasn't that the authorities couldn't identify him. It was that they already had. And once that realization set in, the case was no longer about justice. It was about survival, for reputations, for families, for the very credibility of the sheriff's office. The town's double life. In public, Cozad remained Cozad, farming town, railroad town, quiet and safe. But behind closed doors, the whispers gave it a double life. On the surface, nothing changed. Life moved on. Kids still played in the streets. High school football still lit up Friday nights. But in the shadows, trust was fractured. Who knew the truth? Who was complicit? Who was willing to stay silent, year after year, while a killer walked free? This duality became the scandal itself. Not just the homicide, but the silence around it. A silence that many took as proof of guilt. The most dangerous question. And so we arrive at the question nobody in Cozad wants to say out loud. Was the homicide unsolved because it was impossible to solve, or because it was never meant to be solved? If the man in the Pontiac was tied to law enforcement, if the victim's identity threatened scandal, if the silence was not incompetence but design, then the case becomes not a failure of justice, but a deliberate betrayal of it. And that is the scandal nobody talks about, not because it isn't believed, but because it is believed too much. A homicide without resolution becomes more than a crime, it becomes a mirror. Every community forced to live with an unsolved killing eventually begins to see its own reflection in the cracks of the case. And in Cozad, Nebraska, that reflection was not flattering. The deeper one looks into the silence surrounding the red Pontiac Grand Am, the more one confronts an unsettling possibility. Maybe the lack of closure wasn't accidental. Maybe it was the plan. The vanishing files. One of the strangest aspects of the Cozad homicide is what isn't available. Typically, even unsolved cases leave a paper trail, press releases, composite sketches, descriptions of persons of interest. Yet in this case, nearly nothing was ever released. No timeline published. No appeals for witnesses. No sketch of the Pontiac's driver. It is as though the case was swallowed whole by a locked filing cabinet, vanishing into paperwork that nobody can touch. And when files vanish, the question is never just where they went. The question is why. The whisper of suppressed evidence. Locals whisper about evidence that was quietly collected, then quietly discarded. A wallet that was said to have been found, but never logged. A bloodstain that was seen by a passerby, then later denied. Even a rumor of fingerprints lifted from the Pontiac's door handle, but no official record to confirm it. Could all of this really have been misremembered? Exaggerations twisted over time? Perhaps. But the consistency of these whispers makes them hard to ignore. And in cases like this, suppressed evidence can mean only one of two things: incompetence, or deliberate obstruction. The victim who disappeared twice. Every homicide has two deaths, the physical death of the victim, and the death of their story. In Cozad, the second death came almost immediately. The victim's identity was smothered under a shroud of silence. No press conferences to humanize them. No rallies for justice. Not even a proper obituary in public circulation. It was as if the victim had been erased, not just from life, but from memory. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all. A person was murdered, and yet their very existence became a secret. And when someone's life can be erased so completely, one must ask who had the power to erase it. The dead ends that weren't. Every investigation has dead ends. But in Cozad, some of the supposed dead ends look more like roads that were never walked at all. Witnesses at the Amaco station recall seeing the Pontiac, recall details of the man inside, yet were never called back for follow-up. A trucker claimed he saw the same car speeding eastbound toward Kearney that night, but his account was brushed aside as unreliable. Dead ends, or abandoned leads? If every potential avenue of pursuit was quietly dismissed, then the unsolvable case begins to look less like a tragedy and more like a decision. The fear that silences. In towns like Cozad, silence is not always born of ignorance. Sometimes it is born of fear. Fear of retribution. Fear of shame. Fear of knowing too much. People talk in whispers, but rarely on record. Some say the man in the Pontiac came from a family with influence, the kind of family you didn't cross. Others insist the victim's connections made the entire case too explosive to expose. Fear silences more effectively than any gag order. And in Cozad, fear became the air everyone breathed. The VICAP question. When the case was placed in the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, some celebrated. They thought it meant progress, technology, federal muscle. But others read it differently. VICAP is a database, not an investigation. It collects, it compares, but it does not chase. Once a case enters, it often becomes one of thousands, waiting for a pattern to emerge. Was this entry into VICAP a lifeline, or a burial? The uncomfortable truth is that VICAP may have become the perfect alibi for doing nothing. The case wasn't abandoned, officials could say. It was federal. It was being handled. But was it really? Or was it simply shelved, out of sight, out of accountability? The community's complicity. Another uncomfortable truth is this: communities keep secrets. Cozad, whether by fear, by loyalty, or by apathy, allowed this case to slip into obscurity. There were people who suspected. People who heard things. People who knew more than they admitted. But few spoke, and those who did were dismissed as gossipers, conspiracy theorists, or troublemakers. The silence wasn't only top-down. It was lateral. Neighbor to neighbor. Friend to friend. A collective decision, spoken or unspoken, to let the story die. The question that burns. And so, nearly 3 decades later, the question burns hotter than ever: did Cozad fail the victim, or did Cozad protect the killer? If the investigation was merely incompetent, it is a tragedy. But if it was deliberate, it is something far worse. It is a betrayal, not just of one life, but of an entire community's trust in justice. The dead ends in this case may not be dead at all. They may be markers, pointing directly toward the truth nobody dares to confront. The haunting silence. In true crime, silence is rarely innocent. Silence is a character of its own, one that protects some and damns others. And in Cozad, the silence is deafening. The red Pontiac Grand Am remains etched in memory. The Amaco lights still flicker in old minds. The victim remains nameless, faceless, silenced twice. And the town, whether by design or by fear, has learned to live with the unspeakable. But silence is never permanent. One truth always remains: secrets buried in shadows have a way of clawing back to the surface. The only question is when. Some crimes leave behind bodies. Others leave behind shadows. In Cozad, Nebraska, the March 1997 homicide left behind both. Nearly 3 decades later, the red Pontiac Grand Am, the young man in his mid-20s, and the nameless victim remain etched in memory like ghostly fingerprints. Evidence, sparse and scattered, has long since grown cold. Witnesses have aged. Memories have blurred. And yet the questions persist, sharper than ever. The paradox of the unsolved. Unsolved cases are paradoxical. They are alive and dead at once. They demand attention but resist closure. For Cozad, this paradox has become part of the town's identity. The homicide is a wound that never healed, a story repeated in whispers rather than headlines. The official narrative is thin, almost deliberately so: a homicide occurred. VICAP catalogued it. And then silence. That's all the public has been offered. But silence is never neutral. Silence breeds rumor, suspicion, and fear. A town haunted. Cozad continues to function as any small town does: schools, farms, high school football games. But underneath the routine is a collective unease. Parents call children home earlier than before. Drivers glance suspiciously at any unfamiliar car. Conversations about that night are measured, careful, often ending abruptly when someone asks the wrong question. The man in the red Pontiac is a symbol of this unease, an eternal outsider whose brief appearance became permanent in the town's subconscious. He is remembered not for what he did, or didn't do, but for what he represents, a reminder that the ordinary can mask horror. Theories that refuse to die. Over the years, countless theories have emerged. The stranger who committed the crime in a random, senseless act. A local insider, protected by family ties or connections to law enforcement. The man in the Pontiac as a witness, someone who saw the act and fled in terror. A scandalous affair, a cover-up, and deliberate suppression of evidence. Each theory has supporters and detractors. Each carries a chilling plausibility. And each leaves the same unanswered question: who really pulled the trigger? The fact that multiple theories exist is not just a testament to imagination, it is a testament to how little truth has been revealed. VICAP, keeper of secrets. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program holds the case today. But VICAP is a database, not an investigator. It catalogs, compares, stores. It does not pursue. For all its national reach, VICAP cannot answer the town's questions, cannot restore the victim's name, cannot explain the Pontiac, and cannot reveal whether law enforcement's silence was protective or complicit. In a way, VICAP has become the final character in this story, the keeper of secrets, the archive of unanswered questions, the reminder that some mysteries do not bend to human desire for resolution. The plot twist that lingers. One theory remains particularly scandalous, even decades later, that the man in the Pontiac was connected to law enforcement, perhaps a young officer or a family member of an official. If true, the homicide was not merely an act of violence. It was a crisis of trust, a betrayal so deep that the truth could never be allowed to surface. And if false, it's a testament to the town's imagination, shaped by fear and absence. Either way, the plot twist lingers because it forces a question that nobody wants to answer: can justice exist in a place where silence and influence outweigh evidence? The human cost. Beyond speculation, beyond scandal, is the human cost. A life ended. A town scarred. Families haunted by unanswered questions. Friends haunted by what they didn't see. And the nameless victim, erased from history in the name of secrecy or neglect, whose story remains untold. In true crime, the focus is often on perpetrators. But in Cozad, the tragedy extends beyond a single individual. It is the collective experience of a community grappling with a crime that refuses to close. Why this story matters. Cases like Cozad's are not just small-town mysteries. They are cautionary tales. They remind us that evil can hide behind ordinary gestures: a soda purchased, a car at a pump. They remind us that institutions can fail, whether by incompetence or design. They remind us that the truth, when silenced, becomes a shadow that refuses to fade. And they remind us that unsolved crimes are never truly gone. They live in memory, in rumor, in speculation, and in the lingering fear that what is buried may one day resurface. A legacy of silence. As we conclude this story, the homicide remains unsolved. The red Pontiac remains a ghost. The man in his 20s remains unidentified. The victim remains nameless. And yet, perhaps the story isn't meant to end. Perhaps the point is the tension itself, the mystery, the scandal, the haunting questions that refuse to die. Because some crimes do not close neatly. Some stories do not offer resolution. Some truths remain deliberately, or painfully, hidden. The Cozad homicide is one such story. And the ultimate question remains, lingering in the minds of all who hear it. Did justice fail in Cozad? Or did it simply take its secrets with it into the night? The answer may never come. But one thing is certain: the story, the mystery, and the scandal will endure, because some shadows are too deep to ever vanish.